before the amendments to the family law and to the domestic violence legislation, they were too fearful that the child would be having access with the father without their being present, and they were concerned, so they would stay in that relationship. We talked about mental health issues, so quite often we're assisting people to get support from their GPs. Sometimes there's drug and alcohol issues, well, quite a bit, where people will maybe use that as a coping mechanism. Who here thinks that alcohol causes abuse? Yeah, we've got quite a few people saying yes. Who thinks no? So no one? Okay, so I'll just give you an example. I went to the court to support through the DV, and criminal court was happening at the same time. Friends of court, who are the people who assist people as to where they have to go and what they have to do, were laughing, and I said, what's so funny? And they said, oh, there's a woman in the criminal court, and she's there because on New Year's Eve she wouldn't stop kissing and hugging everybody, and so she was a public nuisance. And even when the police arrived, she was kissing and hugging them and saying Happy New Year, and she just wouldn't stop. So she was drunk, but she wasn't abusive, was she? So does alcohol cause abuse? Not necessarily, it's a variable. There is a lot of research on it, and we're starting to relook it in some ways about how that impacts the body. But the fact is, if you have a few drinks, your conscious mind, your ability to inhibit, it starts to lower. And so then given a few more drinks, whatever you push down there, whatever emotions you push down, they usually surface. So if you're miserable, you quite often see people crying, or if you're angry, they start getting angry. But there is some new research around that, so we're just looking. Who thinks that we could add a condition on a domestic violence order that would say you're not allowed to drink alcohol in the presence of? And in the past we couldn't, because we were told that that was something that would be in the criminal court, but we're now actually starting to see that police are adding that condition to an order because they can breathalyze someone. So I'm just watching that space. Okay, how am I going on time? Badly.
We've got 20 minutes.
Oh, that's okay. So another complexity to think about is, where is the person? This is another thing. Am I ready to leave this relationship, or am I still in love with this person? People are at different places. When police attend a domestic violence incident and they take out an order on behalf of someone, which they have the power to do, quite often when those people come to court to actually go through the court procedures, they say, we don't want this order. We actually don't want it. Both of us do not want this order. And so we say to them, well, you'll have to actually do a submission to police to try and ask them if they've dropped the order, but it's probably going to be really difficult, especially if there's evidence. If they've dialed 000, then there's a recording, police cannot not give an order. But usually they're at a place where they're not ready to leave the relationship because somebody else is trying to intervene. So it's being aware of when you're addressing someone, where are they at? Are they still in this relationship, or are they wanting to leave? Where are they at on that cycle? Okay. So the myths, we've talked a few about some of those myths. So that alcohol causes abuse. We've talked about stress causes abuse. Let's have a look at some of those myths. So common beliefs, and we'll just, if you keep hitting, they should come up. So drug and alcohol, does it cause abuse? No, not necessarily. Does it happen in all areas? It does. If you looked at those 13 deaths, I think we had can't remember what she was. We had a manager of a bank. We had somebody else who was a doctor in something. So we see people from all walks of life. It's not just in low socioeconomic areas. The myth that, the person would leave, it's not that easy. There's many complexities to think about. All abusers grow up in violent homes. As you said before, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to become an abuser or a victim of abuse. Some victims of abuse like violence. I'm not quite sure what it's about. There's a survey if you want to have a look in Victoria. It was just done last year. I was horrified at the results. It puts us back 20 years about what society thinks about domestic violence or about rape. You know, she asked for it by the way she's dressed. So just that thinking, those myths in society need to be changed. That perpetrators have a mental illness. Well, the fact is that a lot of perpetrators, abuse happens behind closed doors, but when they're in public, they have control. So, you know, can they control their temper? Yes, they can, because they're able to control when and how this takes place. And as I said, it's behind closed doors. And that's why it's really hard to prove that domestic violence has occurred, because a lot of it is away from public eye, because they don't want to be seen as a bad person. It's very important for the perpetrator to maintain a nice, you know, I'm a nice guy. Okay, so principles that underpin. So when we're thinking about working together, it's important to understand that, you know, it's a human right, that all forms of violence are a human right, aren't they? So the way that we respond to domestic violence, we need to remember about power imbalances and about gender inequality. And I think one of the things, I don't know who here is thinking about being a police officer or being you know, in the legal profession. It's so important when police go out to an incident. I think cadets is 25 weeks or 35 weeks, something like that. And you get all the training, but it's so important that when you're going out to a domestic violence incident, you need to be talking to people separately, not together, because you're probably going to get someone who's not going to tell you anything and someone who's being extremely nice or blaming. So you've got to work out who is the predominant aggressor here, what is really going on. And if you've got people coming from overseas who don't have English as their first language, they may not necessarily understand. I was horrified when I heard that some police were using children to interpret, because children, we've just seen the impacts of domestic violence, they don't need to be exposed further. The safety of women and children, which is what the legislation talks about, that's paramount. And that we need to hold, and again I'm generalising with men, but we need to hold men accountable for that changed behaviour. And we need to think about the fact that domestic violence occurs across all socio-economic areas. Okay, any questions? Any questions? Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about, I know this is all pretty heavy, and I'm trying to jam it all into an hour. When we're addressing domestic violence, we have these risk indicators in our mind. We do have a risk indicator sheet. If anyone wants to look at a really good tool that looks and measures risk, have a look at the New South Wales, it's called the DVSAT. So just put in DVSAT and it will come up with a risk tool online that people use when working with domestic violence. And it covers all these different high risk indicators. But if you use just a tool without the person's practice wisdom or the victim's voice, you're not going to come up with a true answer. So you need to have all three. So when we're looking at high risk, we're looking at past violence, you know, is it escalating? We're looking at a history of violence, so is there past abuse, different types of abuse? Threats to kill. Unfortunately and very sadly, talking to one of the police prosecutors, and she was saying that, you know, killing a guinea pig, this is what will happen to you. Some of these horrible things towards pets, so threatening someone by doing something where, you know, a pet, that's, yeah, not nice. Threats for suicide. Under the old legislation, threatening to suicide if you leave me was not considered domestic violence. Why do you think that is? Any thoughts? Why would suicide not be considered as domestic violence? Yeah?
Because it's not threatening to harm the other person.
That's right, it's a threat towards self. But it is recognised under the new legislation as being a tactic to try and coerce and to try and control. So if you leave, then I will kill myself or I will harm myself in some way. Access to weapons, you know, without naming places, I know our outreach worker who goes to Gympie, she's quite often ringing me. She finds a lot of abuse out there because it's a rural area, that people have weapons licenses, and so therefore there's more threats with weapons involved. And attempted strangulation, that is a big one. What we quite often hear is women saying that the person starts to strangle them or suffocate or to strangle them, and then they pass out and then come back again, and that this happens and occurs quite a bit, and then that's damage to the brain. I remember in one case talking to DV Connect where they talked about a woman that was put into a motel overnight because there was no women's shelters available or no space for her, and she died overnight because when you strangle someone, there's a swelling that occurs afterwards, and there was no one there they hadn't realised what had taken place, and so she suffocated because she couldn't breathe. So that's a huge one. These are things that are alarming to me. If I'm hearing someone saying he was trying to strangle me, then I've got warning bells. Okay. Stalking is a huge one, and I know that that's a criminal offence under the Criminal Act. Obsessive jealousy, so being so jealous. You're going off with someone else. I know you're meeting someone else. So again, that's that fear of abandonment. You're going to leave me. So accusing them of having an affair or going off with someone else. Measuring how long they were or the petrol that was used. Threats to harm other family members. And, you know, that monitoring using the GPS. I think there's going to need to be some laws around that. The latest thing that I'm hearing now is the drones. So you can actually buy a drone, put it together. There's not a lot of laws around it at the moment, but I'm sure they'll come into effect. But you can spy on someone using a drone. So that's a new area to start watching. Pregnancy we talked about. Forced sex. Or I'm going to threaten to burn down the house. One of the services that we have is called Safety Upgrades, so I've actually had a go at that one as well. And we were trained by police where if we have someone who has a domestic violence order with a condition that says not to enter or remain, so they have to leave the home, we can then go out as a service and assess their home. So we will walk around and we'll look for areas of where the house could be broken into. We would replace windows, locks, we would do lock changes, we might put an alarm on a window, we might change and put the safety screens on there. One of the other things that I found interesting was, and I'd never thought about it myself, was walking around in the garden looking at, if there's a barbecue there, if there's a gas cylinder, whether there's a wheelie bin that could be stood on and they can get through the roof. We're looking at what kind of roof do they have. Do they have tiles? Do they have metal? We had one person that went into the roof and actually came down through the manhole and beat the woman up and she fell down the stairs. She was badly injured. There's all sorts of things to think about when you're actually doing safety upgrades. So burning the house down is a pretty big one that we're listening for. Something else when you're doing your interviews is you need to think about these things. So Aboriginal communities, so the way that legislation, it covers Aboriginal communities, obviously relationships are a little bit different. We need to think about COLD clients, which is culturally and linguistically diverse clients. So, people who are coming from overseas who don't have English as their first language, who might be at court and they may be put as a respondent. They may be being sponsored, so they might be on a spousal visa. So if they leave that relationship, they don't have family, they don't have anywhere to go. We need to think about women with disabilities. Obviously, they're more vulnerable. People with mental health issues, rural communities. So we were going up to Mullaney and we weren't getting any clients. Can anyone think why? Why would we not get clients in Mullaney? Because in Maleny it's a very small community, so if you're coming to see the domestic violence counsellor, many people are going to know. So we weren't able to address Maleny, so what we do now is we send people from Maleny to Caloundra, so they won't be seen in the community. And we need to think about rural communities because they don't have as much services available to them. And we need to think about the elderly, and we need to make sure that we've got services that address other types of relationships. Because if you've got two women coming or two men coming, we need to have somebody who's going to be able to address those kinds of relationships. How are we going on time? We're about there?
We've got 6 minutes.
We've got 6 minutes. If anyone wants to ask any questions, you can always email me and we can try and answer what you need. We always look at protective factors, so whether the person is in jail, if they live a long way away, whether there's a domestic violence order in place, and whether they've got money and transport. Okay, we'll move on. And as I said before, when you're doing a risk assessment, you need to have a valid and reliable tool. You need to have the experience and skills to be able to address that. And you need to also be listening to the victim's voice because they are the best predictor of future violence because they know what the person will more likely do. Yep. What do we do? Well, if we've got someone who's high risk, the first thing we're going to be doing is looking at their immediate safety. We're going to collaborate with them on safety. I'm going to be asking, where is the perpetrator right now? When's he coming back? Are there children? Are they in danger? Do we need to go and get them, or how can you organise that? We'll be looking at their accommodation overnight, and we'll be doing that safety planning. So part of that safety planning would be getting them to put 000 into the phone so they can do a quick speed call. We'll be giving them referral numbers like DV Connect to help them get to a women's shelter if they needed to escape. And we'd be doing what we call the red flagging. So we have with police where we will send them a high risk form and they will then put that on a hyperlink. So when police go out to an incident, we've red flagged that person. And so they're able to see the information that we've provided with that client's consent so that they have been red flagged, their name, their address, their telephone. So if they make a call, police know immediately, this is DV, we need to get there, something is happening, they're high risk. But of course, if it's high risk, then really we need to think about their safety and getting them somewhere else into a women's shelter if they're willing to go. But again, we're guided by their voice and we will say, I'm feeling concerned, what you're saying to me is high risk, because sometimes they'll minimise that. And also we'll be doing the protection order. And like I said before, domestic violence sits under civil legislation. It's considered a civil act. It's not a criminal offence. There are elements of it that are criminal, like assault and the sexual assault. It's up to that person if they want to pursue those areas. Sometimes police will do it anyway, but depending on what level. But should domestic violence sit under criminal or should it sit under civil? Who thinks it should sit under criminal? Yeah? Who thinks it should stay under civil? And the fact is, there's one problem, and I was talking to Scott Woodward yesterday, and he said, if you made it criminal, and if domestic violence happens behind closed doors, under civil, you don't have to prove something has occurred beyond reasonable doubt. If it's criminal, you have to prove that it's happened beyond reasonable doubt. So therefore, if it's happening behind closed doors, how am I going to prove it? And therefore, will I get my domestic violence order or some kind of protection? So that might be something for you to think about. I think we need elements of it, and I think we need to make breaches a lot more, a greater response to breaches to domestic violence. I think we're just about there. Yeah. You can have a look online at our service provision. I've talked quite a bit about it, what we have, and I've also got some brochures down here. That's about it. And if anybody, when you think about statistics, if there's anyone here who feels that they need support based on what we've talked about tonight, we're a free service. So we don't charge, it's domestic violence, we're funded to provide that. And so please come and talk to me afterwards, or feel free to